Merry meet. I'm Aislin and this is Ask Aislin. Happy full moon. I'm so happy to be here tonight. I'm going to talk about the water element in this episode. So any questions that you have, you can always put them in the comments if you're here live, or email them to me. Otherwise, I'm going to get right into tonight's episode. So it's really appropriate that we're talking about the water element on the full moon because there is this connection between the moon and the element of water. So in particular, the lunar phases that are moving and changing, the face of the moon changes throughout the month, just like our emotions change. So the water is connected to our emotional body, our emotional being. So I'm just going to start by giving a little bit of information about the qualities of water, and then I'd like to get into some ways to work with water, including working with the pendulum, which was actually a question that I was sent earlier this week, and I thought it would be great to incorporate it into tonight's episode. So if you ever want to know how to do a pendulum, I'm going to tell you all about it later on, okay? So to get into the water element, we need to think about the qualities of this element. So water is wet, obviously, and it also brings with it the quality of coolness. So this differentiates it from other elements like fire or air that are more warm. So it has that commonality with earth in that it's cool. But unlike earth, which is cool and dry, water is cool and moist, damp, wet, and it shares a fluidity of motion with fire. So a lot of times we think water and fire, they seem to have nothing in common, but if you think about the way that water moves and the way that fire moves, it is a similar action. So I always like to, when I teach the elements, really think about how they connect and how they unfold in a grander scheme than just looking at them individually. Now, aside from the properties of water, there's also some associations that we want to consider. So water is emotional, as we talked about earlier. It's shifting and changing. There's fluidity and flowing to it. So whenever we incorporate any of those qualities into our lives, into our rituals, into our experiences, we are bringing in the element of water. Now, water also has associations with the unconscious. So if you've ever seen the picture of the mind that usually comes from like a Freudian or a Jungian perspective, you will see a iceberg, and up above the water, the tip of the iceberg, is that little bit of our mind that's in there in the consciousness of the world. But most of what's going on inside of us, inside of the mind, is underneath the water. So that picture is really relevant when we're talking about the unconscious mind, because all of that stuff underneath the water, that's the unconscious mind. So because of its connection with the unconscious mind, water also has associations with dreaming, lucid dreaming, we're going to talk a little bit about that later on as well, and with divination, intuition, anything that you can think about that requires someone to go into a flow state in order to excel at it, it probably has some kind of a water association with it. Now, in the Western magical system, we place water generally in the West. There's some systems and some traditions that actually change the order of the elements. When we place it in the West, we are placing it there in a lot of ways because there are these associations with the West, with evening, with afternoon. So there are associations with water in evening, afternoon, also with the fall. So we've talked about this in other episodes. I don't want to get into a lot of it tonight, but if we kind of think about all those cycles that are going on day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, we can always see kind of what parts of the cycle are associated with which elements. In a magical circle, if we want to represent water, like for example on an altar, we might place a bowl of water, we might place a chalice, a cauldron, a cup, a bowl, anything that is kind of womb-like. So again, there's another association with water, the womb. And believe it or not, you don't have to be considered female to have a womb. And everyone has this womb space, which is where much of our creative power comes from. So I'm going to kind of shift gears now and talk a little bit about how the water element plays out in the chakra system. So the chakra energetic system has a lot of similarities to the Western magical system, but there's some differences. So for example, in the the Eastern chakra system, water is associated with the color of orange. This has to do with the fact that water is the element that is connected to the sacral chakra. The sacral chakra is found right beneath the navel by about 3 inches or so. It is the womb space. It's associated with the sexual organs, the reproductive system, hips, all of those parts of the body. And this part of the energetic system vibrates with the color of orange, hence why water and the sacral chakra is associated with orange in that system. So that's a little bit startling to us, because in the Western system, we would think of an orange color as being probably more associated with fire. But again, we don't really have to think of this as being problematic is if we look at the two systems and we see how we would use them perhaps differently. So in the chakra system, if we want to balance the water in us, we want to work with the sacral chakra. This means we want to be working with the hips, we want to be working with the womb space, and we would want to be moving in a fluid manner. So all of a sudden, here's a connection to our Western associations of water. So we want to flow, we want to be fluid. There's also an association here in the sacral chakra with creativity. So again, I talked about in the beginning that whenever we're in like a state of flowing, this means we have tapped into the water element. So think about that idea of creativity. It's really hard to be creative when we're under restrictions, or we have a lot of rules or different things set up that make us not be able to flow, right? When we really move into that flow state, that's usually where our creativity is going to be at its highest point. It's going to be optimized. So you can see all these connections, right, as we kind of go through the different systems. And so then you just kind of decide how are you going to use it. So if you're going to be working energetically, you might be working in the body. If you're going to be working magically, then perhaps you're out in the circle and you're working with the associations there. So let's talk a bit about how we work with the water elements. There's a lot of ways that we can do this, and one way that I really like a lot is through divination. So divination, again, is one of those states. You can't really do divination with a rational mind, right? So again, anything that requires us to go into that flow state, that's water, and divination is one of those things. You can't really have that logical mind talking all the time. You can't have that critic talking if you're really tapping into your intuition. And divination, in a lot of ways, is a tool through which we can use our intuition. So as far as divination goes, there are so many ways. And, you could do class after class after class on these. I'll mention a few, and then I want to get deep into a couple of them. So of course, one of the go-tos is tarot cards, oracle cards. A lot of people like these because they are visual, and many people are visual, so they respond to these visual prompts that are on the card. So even if you don't really know the meanings of the cards, you don't know really much at all about tarot or how divination works, you can respond to the imagery, the symbolism that is on the cards. And I think this is why a lot of people kind of use the tarot as a go-to. I love this tool so much that it, for a long time, had become pretty much my only divination source. And so I decided tonight that we would talk about some alternatives, just to give you some options. You can mix things up. So besides tarot, there's of course runes. They have symbols on the stones, sometimes made out of gemstones they might be, or some kind of a stone. I've seen them made on pieces of wood. They could be made on all kinds of things, clay. And again, they will have these symbols that have some type of a meaning. And through our intuition, the reader will be able to intuit what they mean for the person who is asking the questions or who is getting the reading. Now, like I said, I've used tarot and runes quite a bit, but But I wanted to talk about the pendulum, and I think the pendulum of all of the tools is, you can really see that element of water, because in order to have the pendulum working, we have this moving back and forth, this flowing, ebbing and flowing nature. And so you just can actually see the element of water within the tool. So I'm sure that people have seen a pendulum before, but if not, I'm just going to show you. This is actually one that I got in Sedona before actually right before the pandemic. And so this one has a little Ganesh, amethyst Ganesha, and then has a quartz crystal underneath it. Now, typically with a pendulum, you want to have something that has a point on it, though if you don't need a fancy pendulum like this. You can use a key. You could tie a key to the bottom of a string. I've seen people use beads. So obviously not everyone is using them with that little point, but I do think that if you have something that has a point like this one does, it helps to direct energy. So how do we use it? Well, the thing about the pendulum and like any of the divination tools is they're acting like a receiver. So it kind of depends on your own perspective of where the messages come from. And it really doesn't matter. I mean, I'll give you my opinion on it, and anybody you ask is probably going to give a different opinion. But at the end of it all, what they all share in common is that there is some type of a message that's coming through a receiver, which in this case is the pendulum. So some people feel that the messages are coming through from angels, from guides, from spirits on the other side. I mean, some people would even possibly think that the messages are coming through from demons, if you think that divination is an evil thing, and there are people who think that. Personally, I think it comes from all of these things. And and part of this has to do with my belief that, kind of all is one. But I really do think that a lot of what we're receiving through intuition and through a divinatory method is information coming from our higher source, coming from the universe, coming from the higher self. So, again, it doesn't matter what I think, because if it resonates with someone else that it's coming from an angel or coming from some kind of spirit guides, again, I think that's all kind of related, kind of all the same thing, right? Where does the higher self end and the universe begin, and where do the spirit guides end and we begin? So if it's all one, it really doesn't quite matter where the source is coming from. But what matters is we as the receiver. So we have this tool that kind of helps us bring the message through, and then we as the receivers have to interpret it. That is the hardest part. So with the pendulum, there are a few things that we can do in order to make sure that we are going to receive the messages in the right way, and that we are in a state where we can actually receive them. So one of the things that I recommend if you're going to use a pendulum is when you first get it, and before it's been used, or suppose it's been used a while and it's kind of time to cleanse it, I do recommend that you cleanse any tool that you use, but in this case we're talking about the pendulum. So one of the things you can do is you can cleanse it with moon water. We're going to talk a little bit about moon water in a bit. I recommend personally, cleansing it with all of the elements if possible. So you can, run it through fire to cleanse and purify it through the element of fire. You can dip it in water, moon water, if you want, to cleanse it through the element of water. You can blow on it, you can smudge it, you can run a feather over it to cleanse it with the element of air. And then with earth, you could bury it. A lot of people will kind of bury it. It'll put all of its negative energies down into the earth to be recycled. But if you need something that's going to be a little faster, you could always rub salt on it if you want. So there's a lot. You get creative. You just need to find a way that works for you, that you can cleanse it with the 4 elements. So once it's been cleansed, you need to, you basically need to, I don't know what I would call this, but you need to get to know the motions of the pendulum for you individually. So by this, what I mean is that when you first start to use a pendulum, it will move, just on its own sometimes. And it can have to do too with, there's a slight trembling of the arms sometimes when we're holding something like this. But if you hold it long enough, the pendulum will eventually start to slow down, and then it may actually start to do some kind of repetitive motion. So sometimes they will go back and forth, sometimes they will go in circles, spiral motion. And for everybody, this is going to be a little bit different, and this is where it becomes important that you realize what it's going to be doing for you. So when you're first using it, I would recommend that you confirm the yes and no answers. So one of the things about the pendulum is that you're sort of limited in what kinds of messages can come through. Yes and no messages generally are the best ones, especially if you're starting out. So what you would want to do is ask the pendulum a few questions that are that you know the answer to. So easy ones like, what is your, my name is my name Aislin? And then see what motion the pendulum knows, because you know the answer to that. You know if that's yes or no. Is my birthday blah, blah, blah. Do I live in? And you get questions that you know are either yes or no. And then through a bit of time, you're going to start to understand what motion is yes. So sometimes it'll be, left for yes, right for no. It'll be clockwise for yes, counterclockwise for no. But it's going to be different for everybody. So it's really wise to take that step in the beginning and set that for yourself, kind of understand what that's going to be for you. And then once you get going, then you can start asking it other questions that you maybe don't know the answer to or you're looking for advice about. And with any divinatory tool, it's important to really have faith in the method. If you're constantly questioning it, it gets in the way of what you're doing. So if you decide I'm going to work with the pendulum, you really want to go all in, right? And so you don't necessarily have to believe in it at first. This is like anything, but you need to suspend your disbelief at least, because if you can't do that, then the tool is probably not going to work for you. So I spent a lot of time on talking about that, so I'm going to jump into the next thing. But if anybody wants to know more about the pendulum, definitely get a hold of me, send me a message or something. I did want to, before I move on, I wanted to show one thing though, is that once you get more advanced at using the pendulum, you don't have to just ask yes and no questions. So I made this a long time ago, and it is, it's almost like a spirit board kind of way of looking at this, but you can place this and you can actually have the pendulum, once you know how to use the pendulum pretty well, you can ask it questions that have more than just a yes and no answer. It might actually be able to spell things out for you. But that's a little bit more advanced. But I just wanted to let you know that sometimes people think there's not a lot of options with the pendulum that exist, like with tarot, for instance. But you can gain a lot of information from a pendulum. And there's a lot of ways that you can use it I didn't even get into. I'm just talking strictly about divination tonight. So another thing that kind of goes hand in hand with the pendulum is automatic writing. So automatic writing is kind of in a similar idea, is you are using a tool to bring information through. So whether this is coming from the higher self, the spirit guides, it kind of depends on who you talk to. Sometimes people will say that, through automatic writing, we're actually bringing in other spirits to talk through us. And while that can be an intention, you can also use automatic writing just to connect to your higher self. And that's how I generally will use it. So just to talk a little bit about it, like with the pendulum, it's really important, really with any divinatory tool, but especially with the automatic writing and the pendulum, is to be quite relaxed. Because remember, if we're going to be working with the water element, we need to somehow enter that flow state, right? So our logical brain, our rational mind, all of this needs to somehow shut off for the moment. So one of the ways we do this is we become very relaxed. So whatever it takes to get you really relaxed, you want to engage in that. So whether that's meditation, breath work is really good, because another thing that will move us into a flow state is repetitive motion. So if you know Kundalini energy exercises, anything like that, there's a lot of repetitive motion. So something like that would be really good at getting someone into a flow state prior to using trying automatic writing. So that's what we want to do first. And ideally what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring ourselves into an alpha state where we are, it's almost like we're in a light hypnotic, or not a hypnotic, but a light trance state. So it's not that we're out of it, we don't know where we are, but we have dropped down out of that beta wave, everyday kind of brain wave pattern that we're in. We drop down into alpha, and now we're more receptive to what's coming through to us. So we want to do this, get into this relaxed state, and then what you want to do is allow your hand to get really relaxed as well. Your hand is what is going to be bringing the message through. So as you do this, you can have a question in mind. You can start with kind of a blank state or slate, but sometimes at first it's good to have some kind of a question in mind, and then you just allow what comes through your hand to come through. So I know this sounds a little bit tough, because what happens if you just sit there with that pen and nothing comes through, and maybe it won't the first time. But a lot of times if you get really relaxed, what happens to me when I do it is that I'll kind of know it's time, because my hand, it's almost like it doesn't feel like it's my own. And just kind of like the pendulum begins to move back and forth, my hand will circle a little bit, and I know that it's time to write. So when you start writing your automatic writing, you should try to really turn off the inner critic, because at first it may just look like gobbledygook. Some of it doesn't even make any sense what you're writing, but just go with it. Just let it write what's there, and you may notice that it's difficult to read. Like if you have good handwriting, sometimes what comes through the automatic writing is not your handwriting. It's a little bit difficult to read, but I really recommend that you just kind of go with it. Suspend your disbelief, right? And then see what comes out. And then afterwards, then you go in and then you can try to interpret what came through. Can you make any sense of the message? There might be a bunch of words that don't make sense, but maybe there are phrases that stand out. And that's what we're really looking for. Because remember, with any of this, we are channeling information that is coming from, outside of us, right? And problem is that even though it's coming outside of us, even though we've gone into a relaxed state, it still has to be interpreted through us, right? And so some of what comes through, it may not quite make sense. It's almost like your rational mind doesn't know what that is, and so it just will write something, a word that may not make sense. But I promise you that if you try it enough, you will start to see phrases that do make sense and that do relate to whatever your question was. So one other thing I wanted to mention though is if you do try this and it doesn't work at all. So let's say you sit there and it doesn't feel like anything's coming, then what I would recommend doing is trying stream of consciousness writing first. So this is something I use. A lot of people don't know this, but I actually teach math and writing in the day. I work with students online, I homeschool kids, and a lot of my writing students, they get very blocked with their writing. They can't write very, they feel like they can't write very well because they can't get the words out on the page. So I feel that this stream of consciousness writing is something that I use to get them unstuck. And it's really simple. You just pick a topic, any topic, giraffes, dreams, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what topic you pick. You set a timer, usually 3 to 5 minutes when you're beginning, and you just write for 3 minutes about anything until the timer goes off. Write about that topic until the timer goes off. And if you can't think of anything to write, you just write, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write, until finally something comes out. So sometimes if we're blocked a little bit when we try the automatic writing, if we do that stream of consciousness writing first, where we're still conscious of everything, we're not in that flow state yet, it can sometimes, just like my writing students, it can almost like it breaks that writer's block. It just like shaves that little bit off the top, and you may be able to drop in and do the automatic writing afterwards. So I recommend you try that if you're having a little bit of trouble. So a few other things, other ways to work with the water element. Dream work is awesome. We can work with lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming is a type of dreaming where we become aware while we're dreaming that we are dreaming. So sometimes it can come very easily for people. Some people, all they have to do is before they go to sleep, they just say, I will wake up in my dreams, and some people are able to do this. The key to lucid dreaming is to somehow wake up in the dream and realize that you're in a dream. Once you realize you're in a dream, you break the rules that are around you and you realize that you can do anything. So I think that I like this idea of saying I will remember my dreams, or I will lucid dream, or I will wake up in my dreams. While it works for some people, it doesn't work for everyone though. And so if you feel it's not going to work for you, or you've tried it and it didn't, what I would recommend is trying to do some reality checking while you're awake. Really commit to this. So it's going to sound a little silly when I explain it, but really commit to it for several days. And then you will make this almost like an automatic thing, and you will be able to then do this in the dream, and this will trigger you to realize that it's a dream. So here's what I mean by reality checking. So every couple of hours, you could spread this out throughout the day, do it 2 or 3 times, and you're going to run through 4 reality checks. And you don't have to do all of these, but at least do a couple of them. So the first one is mirrors. So you'll look in a mirror, and you want to look at yourself and make sure that you look like yourself. Because one of the things that happens in dreams is that when we look in mirrors, reality doesn't appear the way it does when in the waking world. So one way that you can tell that you're in a dream is by looking in a mirror and realizing that your reflection isn't there or it isn't right. Now, what you got to do though is you got to do this in your waking world though enough times that it becomes automatic enough that you're going to do it when you're sleeping. So to get back to our little reality check, so every couple of hours, so one of them would be look in the mirror and just make sure your appearance looks the same. So obviously when we're waking, I'm going to look there, and yes, I look like I should, and that's my reality check. Okay, so the second one is a solid object. So pressing against a wall, the table, even your own fist. Make sure that your fist doesn't go through your other hand. It won't if we're awake, but it will if we're dreaming. So when we're dreaming, physical things don't have a solidity to them like they do in the waking world. So that's another reality check we can do. So just press into something that's solid and just say, yep, it's solid. The third one is looking at your hands. So one way to trigger yourself in a dream to know that you're dreaming is to look down at your hands, and they won't look right oftentimes. So in the waking world, we can look down at the hands to act as the trigger. Yep, my hands look okay, I'm awake. And then the final thing is breathing. So in the dream world, we don't need to breathe in the same way. We don't need air to breathe there. And so what you can do in the waking world in your reality check is plug your nose. I can't breathe. Okay, I must be awake. So see what I'm doing here is each of these, I'm doing it in the waking world, and I'm saying, okay, I must be awake. And it seems, like I said, it seems kind of silly, but if you do this enough, do it a couple times a day for several days, then see what happens in the dreams. Because you become automatic in the waking world, it's very likely that you'll actually try these tests when you're dreaming, and that's going to trigger you to realize, I'm dreaming. Now, the moment that happens, you're lucid dreaming now, and now the sky's the limit. So I just really love those little reality checks. I wanted to give those to you, and I would love to hear any feedback if anybody tries them and if they have any effect on their lucid dreaming abilities. So outside of lucid dreaming, there are other things we can do with dreaming. There's herbs and tinctures we can use to help us remember dreams or to help us have more vivid dreams. As far as herbs goes, blue lotus is a good one, passion flower, mugwort, and I would say rosemary too, because rosemary is a good herb for remembrance. So if you really want to remember your dreams, it would be nice to have like kind of some rosemary there. You can make dream sachets or little dream pillows. You can put these herbs under your pillow. You can also do some kind of dream magic. So like, let's say there's a question that you have. Let's say you have 2 options, and you can't really decide which path to take. You can do a little bit of, preparation before going to sleep. And then upon going to sleep, before you go to sleep, just repeat the question over and over. Which path do I choose? Which path do I choose? And then see how you feel when you wake up. Even if you don't remember the dreams, you've actually, you kind of put this intention out there before you went to sleep. So now see what comes back in return. So there's a lot we can do with, dream work in that way. I did mention that I would talk a little bit about making moon water. So making moon water is a great way to work with the water element. Moon water can be made during any phase of the cycle. So tonight's the full moon. It's a great time to put your moon water out. It can be as simple as just putting a jar or a glass of water out under the moon. One of the things you want to make sure you do, though, is that you don't allow it to still stay out there when the sun comes up. So whether it is put it out for a bit of time and take it back in that night, or just make sure you take that out before the sun comes up. We just really don't want any sun to be there. Otherwise, we're bringing sun energy into the water, and that kind of defeats the purpose of it being moon water, right? So we can do it for the full moon, we can do it for the new moon, you can do it for any phase of the moon. And one thing I really like about moon water is that, let's suppose that you are in the waning moon phase. We're in the waning moon phase, okay? And let's say that you want to do a spell that is more appropriate for the waxing moon, but you don't have the 2 weeks to wait to get to the waxing moon. You need to do that right now, right? So, what do? So one of the things you can do is, if you have some waxing moon water, you can use that in the spell. Even though the spell is taking place during the waning moon, it helps you bring in some of that waxing moon energy. So the moon water is great in that respect, because you can bottle it, you can store it, and now you have the moon's energy through any different phase. You can use it even when you need to do a working that's a little out of sync with the phase that we're in. So outside of that, I just wanted to talk a bit about emotions. So we said in the beginning, the water element has to do with the emotions. So working with our emotions is really key if we want to make sure our water element is balanced. Our emotions are fluid. They do not define who we are. It feels like they do sometimes, especially when we have very intense ones. If we're feeling a lot of grief or sadness, it can feel as though that defines us, as though that's who we are. But if we remember, just like the moon, it passes. It's phases that we go through. Emotions are fluid. So just as they come, like the ebb and tide, or the ebb and flow of the ocean, just like they come, they can go as well. So trying to remember that, that we don't have to be defined by our emotions, and just knowing that. It may not take away the sadness, but knowing that, you're not defined by it, and there will be different emotions. And in fact, as you get better at working with the water element, you'll kind of even see that it becomes easier to change the emotions that you have. And another thing to think about with the water element and emotions is really thinking about our own responses, our own emotional responses to other people. Other people are responsible for their actions. We're responsible for our own actions. Other people are responsible for theirs. But what they're not responsible for is how we react or we feel about what they do. So that is a little hard for people to swallow sometimes. We want people to be responsible for the way they made us feel, but at the end of the day, that's kind of where the responsibility ends. They're responsible for what they did and said, but they're not really responsible for how we took it. So when we kind of realize that, we actually empower ourselves, because we're able to change, or at least we can accept that, right? If we can at least accept that, we know that we can then change our emotions when we want to, when we need to. So we can, when we have that power over our emotions to transmute them into something different, this is where our real self-knowledge, comes out. So I talked about shadow work before. Shadow work, or some other deep internal emotional work, is a really great way to work with the emotions. And I'm out of time, so I'm just going to stop now. I had a little bit more to talk about, but I will add that probably into another segment sometime. So let me just make sure there's no comments here or questions that I've missed. Okay, great. I just wanted to wish everybody a happy full moon. I hope you have some great plans, and whatever you do, maybe think about some of the things that we talked about here tonight about bringing that water element in. Maybe even considering visiting some places where the water element is prevalent, like the ocean. That's where I'm going tonight. Every full moon, I go to the ocean to do my full moon Esbit there. So maybe consider going somewhere, or being around the water element in some way. Take a nice bath, a nice shower, swim in the pool. Try to somehow bring some water element in, and if anything, just drink some water and just really feel how it feels to have that element in you. All right, until next time, blessed be and happy full moon.